I was a little bit aware of tantric philosophy under the name Kashmir Shaivism from quite a young age, maybe around 18 or so. And I didn't understand it or anything like that. And some years later at university is when I first delved into the teachings and tradition of Tantric Shaivism with one of my first teachers, Paul Muller Ortega. And he taught a course called Hindu Tantric Yoga. And this was back in the year 2000. And that was revelatory. That was a revelatory experience because I'd been studying Indian religion and spirituality for a number of years by that point, and also practicing. And this tradition of Tantric Shaivism was astonishing in terms of its depth, with the other traditions that I was really interested in the history of Indian spirituality, like the poet saints, the bhakti movement, Vedanta, and so on. They all were very profound, but also I could see sort of the horizon with each of these traditions, how much of it could be studied, and with Tantric Shaivism, also known as Shaiva Tantra, it was like discovering a bottomless rabbit hole, just a incredibly rich, incredibly complex tradition. And I was attracted to it initially because I thought, well, this is something I could study for a lifetime and not run out of interesting things to look at. And little by little, I also became aware of the profound practices of the tradition, and that it really offered a more comprehensive view, combined with practice, of the whole dimension of human experience that we call spiritual awakening. So I suppose its comprehensive nature and its depth is what attracted me to it. And yeah, here I am, whatever, almost 3 decades later, and I indeed haven't run out of things to study in this beautiful tradition. And also there's the temptation to study it because it's one of the world's great lost treasures. People are very much aware of some of the other great spiritual traditions of the world, and this one not so much, even though in its own time it was just as influential and popular and significant as anything else on the planet. But through the vagaries of history, it's almost forgotten today compared to other world-famous spiritual traditions. So there's that pull to help it, I suppose, support the tradition itself to become known once again. And it's cool to, learn about a treasure that most people don't know about. There's a thrill to that for some people, I suppose. When someone asks me to describe the nature of reality from my vantage point, right away I just try to explain that my vantage point, I don't really have a personal vantage point, and that's because I've been studying this tradition for so long now, and its view has become my view, and I don't really have a view on the nature of reality. I mean, I think it's presumptuous in a way to have a view on the nature of reality that's a personal opinion that you stand by. I think it makes much more sense to survey the various views that are out there, and this is something I did back in the day. And then you find one that resonates the most, and you go deep into that. So, in other words, I'm saying that I think it's the wrong question if somebody asks my opinion about the nature of reality. And for me, the right question is what view of the nature of reality seems to someone who's studied this subject their whole life the most compelling view. And so, yeah, for me, that is the view of non-dual Shaiva Tantra, which I'll try to sum up. Now, a complex spiritual tradition doesn't just have one view. It has a bunch of interrelated views of the nature of reality. But when we speak of non-dual Shaiva Tantra, we're primarily speaking of the lineage of Uṭṭaladeva and Abhinavagupta and Kshemaraja, and this is sometimes called a Trika Krama lineage because there's these two primary streams that feed into it, the Trika and the Krama. But anyway, those are just sort of the historical details. What is the view of the nature of reality that was championed by these great masters on the basis of scripture, on the basis of logical reasoning, and on the basis of their own direct experience? And philosophically, you could call it a kind of monistic idealism, but for most people who aren't very well versed in philosophy, it's better to just try to explain what that view is. And this is difficult to do because most people in the world today are so deeply indoctrinated with the materialist view or the physicalist view, right? The supposedly scientific view that matter is what's fundamental to the nature of reality, and consciousness is an accidental emergent property of the complexity of matter. And so that supposition is just a supposition. And when we look at a view that is radically different from that, it's very hard to try to explain it because it requires us to undo all of our assumptions about the nature of reality to even understand what's being said, and most people don't do that readily. So, nonetheless, I'll try to give a nutshell to this, which is there's no good reason to presume that the nature of reality is fundamentally different from what you directly experience. And what you directly experience, and I directly experience, is consciousness. We don't actually directly experience matter. The concept of matter is, in fact, a concept. What we experience all the time, moment to moment, in every moment, throughout our entire lives, are various permutations of consciousness. Appearances, sounds, textures, flavors, thoughts, feelings, and so on. Endless permutations of consciousness. So therefore, the view of the nature of reality that assumes the least unprovable things is the view that consciousness alone exists, and that this whole world is a manifestation of consciousness. That is to say, there is no world apart from consciousness, apart from, we could say, the sum total of all conscious experiences had by all conscious beings, right? So what we mean by the world in this view is simply the sum total of all experiences had by all conscious beings. And there is no other world. There's no objective reality that beings are experiencing but would be here without their experience. That supposition is both unprovable and not necessary. So if everything is consciousness, how does that change our experience of reality? Well, that's the part we can't explain logically. That's the part that's not sort of philosophically justifiable, right? It cannot be arrived at through reason alone. That is to say, it's through the direct experience of everything as consciousness that we realize the life-changing implications that can scarcely be explained. So let me try to give a tiny window into this. I would have stopped studying this some years ago if it hadn't become my direct experience. If everything is consciousness, then what are the relationship of conscious beings to each other? Well, the relationship must be one of unity. That is to say, there's one consciousness that is experiencing through all these different body minds. One consciousness that is looking through this pair of eyes and the pair of eyes watching this video and all pairs of eyes that exist. So now this proposition can be philosophically defended, but it's the direct experience of it that is truly what's convincing and life-changing. So there's a sense of connection that is only possible when the unity of consciousness is realized, that there is indeed one consciousness gazing out through the eyes of all conscious beings. And so the direct realization of that in one's own experience means the end, the permanent end of isolation, alienation, loneliness, and the forms of existential angst that proceed from those experiences. And since that's really the primary form of suffering for most human beings, assuming their very basic needs are met, the most common form of suffering is this isolation, alienation. And so to have that completely obliterated is an astonishing paradigm shift. And again, it comes not only through contemplation of a philosophy, but through practices that organically evolved with that philosophy. So I've, not really succeeded in covering this because it takes a while to try to explain it. But to sum it all up in a little nutshell, we could say, metaphorically speaking, that everything that exists is a dream in the mind of God. But what do we mean by God? We mean the power of consciousness through which all beings are conscious to whatever extent that they are. So in this tradition of Tantric Shaivism, the word God, or Shiva in Sanskrit, doesn't mean a superhuman, supernatural person. It means the power of consciousness by virtue of which all conscious beings are conscious to whatever degree that they are. So, to shift experience from the default one, in which we live in a vast, uncaring, empty, and meaningless universe in which we are just a tiny accidental speck of life that will soon be obliterated, and there's no point to it ever having existed. From that view, to shift to this view is quite profound, because in fact the universe exists precisely for us and because of us. That is to say, the universe only exists as an expression of consciousness, and it only exists because there are beings to be conscious of it, since it's a product of consciousness. So again, there's no way to prove this in words, but the direct experience that absolutely everything that you see, touch, taste, hear, smell, feel, or think about is an expression of what you fundamentally are. And that this whole world is a play of that universal consciousness, which is your own true nature. This is a revelatory, powerful, beautiful way to experience reality. Why would a spiritual tradition conceived over 1,000 years ago be in any way relevant to humans in the 21st century? Some people do have this question, and I would answer it in two ways. First of all, humans have not changed in any fundamental way for at least several thousand years, maybe longer. Meaning to say, though we're using our brains in different ways, the fundamental range of human values and feelings and needs is the same. The fundamental human aspirations are the same. So something that worked 1,000 years ago to speak to the deepest needs and questions that human beings have is indeed still going to be relevant today. But there is another and perhaps more important reason. So about 1,500 years ago, in the year 500 or a little before that of our Western calendar, is when Tantra arose as a spiritual movement, when it entered the historical record anyway. And it's no coincidence that that time period was just after the fall of the Gupta Empire, which was comparable in many ways to the Roman Empire. So as the Roman Empire was to Europe, the Gupta Empire was to India a couple of centuries later. And so when the empire fell, India fragmented into many, many, many small principalities and warring states, and life became very uncertain for people. So uncertain as in, you never knew what was going to happen. Like, soldiers from a nearby kingdom might march through and burn your whole village to the ground tomorrow, or the local king might be victorious, and suddenly riches flow into your area of India, and the list goes on and on. Life was very, very uncertain. One didn't know how long one would live, if one would die violently, all this sort of thing. So Tantra arose in that context as a system of spiritual practice that not only sought to give people a broader context for their experience, help people experience the bigger picture view, which renders life meaningful in spite of all the vagaries of history and karma and so on. But also, Tantra developed technologies to help people become radically flexible and strong in an emotional and psychological way, So Tantra offered practices that help people become more resilient, strong, and flexible in their body and mind and psychology, and thereby respond more readily and effectively to the challenges of a very uncertain world. So probably you can see what I'm angling towards here, which is that the 21st century is also a very uncertain time for human beings. And depending on where you live in the world, it might be almost as uncertain or equally uncertain to that time when Tantra came about as a spiritual movement. So this is merely a hypothesis on my part. Let me be clear. This is merely a hypothesis that people are drawn to this tradition for that reason, among others, because they feel its potential to empower them. Other spiritual traditions are exclusively about truth or realization, and Tantra is as well, but it's also about empowerment. And people want ways to be empowered. They want to be able to respond flexibly and with resilience to an ever-changing cultural, social, and environmental landscape. And so Tantra arose in just such a context, and therefore serves us in a similar context. But even with this hypothesis, to be honest, I am hard-pressed to explain the degree of resonance that I see, because I teach tantric philosophy and practice all over the world. And whether it's Asia, Europe, South America, Brazil, for example, like all these countries all over the world, and people have this incredible resonance with these teachings. And they, after the workshop, in whatever country I'm in, there's all these people coming up to me. Oh my gosh, this is what speaks to me. This feels like real spirituality. So I don't know exactly why it's so resonant beyond some of the hypotheses I've already offered. But it might also have to do with the fact that it enshrines some great spiritual truths in a non-dogmatic, non-religious way. We should definitely add that into the mix of our explanations. But still, even add up all the explanations I can think of, and there's something magical happening, it would seem, in terms of the degree to which this tradition is appealing to people in all different cultures all over the world. But how can this tradition of classical Tantra serve as a remedy for some of the problems of modern life? Well, in that regard as well, it is uniquely well equipped because in modern life, people are constantly distracted. They're constantly assaulted by stimuli coming at them from all directions, way too much stimuli. And they are ungrounded in various ways, and they're sometimes adrift. They're not sure what to do or why, or what their purpose is. And the tradition of classical Tantra answers these and does provide a remedy, perhaps not uniquely. There's other traditions that do a good job as well. But it's a tradition of meditation and mindfulness, of course, and helps us become undistracted, helps us process stimuli better, helps us reduce the amount of stimulation we're experiencing, helps us become more grounded through these various spiritual practices, not only meditation and mindfulness, but also what we call energy body practices that connect us to our energy and our aliveness in various ways, and our connection with the energetic matrix of the planet. So that can be very grounding, and to feel your intimate connection with all life and to live in such a way that you are in service to life instead of parasitic on life brings greater sense of meaning. So there's more that could be said about all of that, but that's just a brief explanation for how Tantra serves as a remedy for some of the ills of modern life. Both the academic field of tantric studies and interest in the tradition amongst practitioners has been growing for some decades now. And the reasons for this are complex and historically interesting, though we don't have time here to go over them in too much detail. But even though Kashmir is predominantly Muslim now and has been for a few hundred years, there were Hindu rulers of Kashmir 100 years ago, and they decided to publish these ancient manuscripts that contained much of the wisdom of classical Tantra. In fact, these manuscripts were found not only in Kashmir, and hence Kashmir Shaivism is a misnomer, if you're familiar with that term, because many key manuscripts have also been found in Nepal, in Kerala, and in other parts of India as well. So it's really the tradition of Tantric Shaivism that we're talking about that happened to flourish in Kashmir a little bit more than it flourished anywhere else. But anyway, it's these Hindu rulers of Kashmir 100 years ago decided to publish these manuscripts, print them and distribute them to universities. So in that way, people discovered, wow, these are some fascinating texts that all the scholars already knew about Vedanta and Buddhist philosophy, but not many people knew about this tradition, which had fallen into obscurity mainly because of the Muslim conquest of northern India, which was always the stronghold of Tantra in its heyday. So people discovered these texts and were like fascinated, and so very, very slowly the awareness percolated. But then also what happened, it's not just an academic story, thankfully, is in the late 20th century there were some great and influential gurus, spiritual masters, like Swami Lakshmanju of Kashmir, who had many Western disciples, and Swami Muktananda of Maharashtra, who popularized the teachings of Tantric Shaivism, and whose influence also helped to get translations, some of the earliest translations, published in English, both in India and the West. So a whole confluence of circumstances made it possible. And then starting in the 1980s, there was a huge reignition of tantric studies. Of course, there had been tantric studies happening more than 100 years ago with Sir John Woodruff, if you've heard of him, also known as Arthur Avalon. But then a reignition in the 80s among students of Swami Lakshmanju who became academics, such as Alexis Sanderson and Bettina Boehmer and Mark Dishkovsky and Lillian Silburn, to name a few. And we're lucky that these were quite brilliant people, and are, a couple of them still alive, are quite brilliant people, and so and interested in the tradition as practitioners as well as scholars, in most cases, not all cases. So they helped to foster this sort of revolution in tantric studies. And the younger generation that I'm a part of, not that young, but still the younger generation compared to those guys, we got into the tradition as practitioners encouraged by our spiritual teachers and then became academics later. So there's many examples of this as well. People like Hamsa Stainton and Ben Williams and Jeff Lidke and Shaman Hatley. These are all great, relatively young scholar practitioners, some more serious about the practice than others, but all really genuine folks who are taking the field that step further. And many of them are often in conversation as well with popular spiritual teachers, not popular in the sense of famous, but in the sense of non-academic spiritual teachers who are also sharing these teachings with seekers, spiritual seekers and meditation practitioners. So it's actually quite an exciting time for those who are interested in classical Tantra. This is a very exciting time, even though the vast majority of materials for the study and practice of the tradition have not been published. So the great majority is still in Sanskrit, not in English or any other Western language, and not even in good Hindi translations either, for that matter. So most people in India do not have good access to these teachings either. But more and more and more translations are coming out all the time, more and more studies, and we can look forward to a time perhaps another 5 or 6 decades from now, when the bulk of the most important teachings this tradition has to offer are translated. So it's exciting to be part of that wave moving forward, because yes, there are some teachings and practices in this tradition that might play a part in helping save humanity from itself, of course I mean. By bringing us closer and closer to what one spiritual teacher calls basic sanity, which is still all too rare in this world. People who know that this tradition of classical Tantra or Shaiva Tantra or Tantric Shaivism was almost lost wonder, could it still be lost? And the answer, thankfully, is no. As long as people are interested in it, it's not going to be lost because almost all the manuscripts that exist have been photographed, have been microfilmed. Now, it's a huge amount of material that has not yet been read. Well, there's, 1 or 2 people on Earth who've read almost all of it, but a lot more work needs to be done. But the good news is that the great, great, great majority of the manuscripts that document this incredible tradition are preserved in one way or another, digitally, microfilm, microfiche, etc. And most of them are cataloged, but most of them are not translated. So the tradition is now well preserved in the sense of it's not going to be further lost, but not well preserved in the sense that there are still not many translations compared to the amount of material that there is total. So that's why more and more scholars getting involved is a great thing, and we'll see more and more development of understanding of this tradition going forward. Jaya Shiva Shambhu.